Welcome to Whatsoever More or Less. My name is Jason, and today I have a thought for you on pitting profit against profit. This is something that I've kind of discovered through, about 3 years ago. I hit this point where I was studying Defending Our Divinely Inspired Constitution by President Oaks, or maybe I was reviewing an Ezra Taft Benson quote, and I realized that something President Benson had prophesied, President Oaks was saying something similar to it. Now, I'm not allowed to declare the same way that President Nelson declared during his prophecy, that a prophecy by President Kimball about the women of the Relief Society was being fulfilled in his time. I'm not qualified to declare that through President Oaks, the prophecy of President Benson and others is getting fulfilled. But this much I can say: it led me on a journey of astonishment. Okay, I was absolutely excited at what I saw, and so this is it. President Benson said, this is in his talk that he gave as the prophet, called The Constitution of Heavenly Banner, which had a longer book version called The Constitution of Heavenly Banner, but the other one was the BYU talk, which was directed to all members of the church, similar to the recent talk from Dallin H. Oaks on mantles, right? And then he also gave a shorter version in General Conference called Our Divine Constitution, which had pretty much the exact same exhortations. And then he had an Ensign article version called, if I'm not mistaken, The Constitution, a Glorious Standard. Okay, so he says, I have faith that the Constitution will be saved, but it won't be saved in Washington. That should grab everybody's attention right there. It won't be saved in Washington. That pretty much debunks the white horse prophecy, by the way. But another point, he says it will be saved by good members of the church who subscribe to and are familiar with the principles of the Constitution, and I think I'm saying that right. And it will be saved by citizens who love the principles of the Constitution, or who love freedom, right? But the key word that grabbed my attention is he says those who will participate in the saving the Constitution will be those who know the principles of the Constitution. And what was the main content of Defending Our Divinely Inspired Constitution? If you're a nerd like me, you've studied that talk like 30 times, okay? Which is an amazing talk, and that one's by President Oaks when he was the counselor to President Nelson. He taught the principles of the Constitution, and that's what President Benson said we would need to know to be able to save the Constitution. Now, to top it off, President Oaks, at the footnotes of his Defending Our Divinely Inspired Constitution, references President Benson's talk and says, the principles I'm teaching aren't the exact same ones that Ezra Taft Benson taught, but they're similar. And they aren't the exact same ones that J. Reuben Clark taught either, but they're similar. Now, if you know the history of the bicentennial of the Constitution, President Benson was our prophet. Call that a coincidence all you want to, okay? And Dallin H. Oaks was a fairly new apostle, only been in for about 3 years. And both of them were major speakers at BYU on the topic of the Constitution around that time, along with L. Tom Perry. And L. Tom Perry got up and spoke very highly of the principles of the Constitution that had been taught by Dallin H. Oaks at another Provo event that wasn't part of BYU or anything like that. L. Tom Perry spoke fairly highly of them. So these principles have been getting discussed since those days when President Benson gave that prophecy, but they kind of sat there and were forgotten. And President Oaks has refined them since then. He's in his talk Defending Our Divinely Inspired Constitution versus his original talk at Provo called Our Divinely Inspired Constitution. He is much more straightforward, and he even says in that talk the most important years he's had of studying the Constitution are his past 37 years as an apostle, right? So, but still the same. I've gone on a significant journey of studying President Benson and of studying President Oaks. For example, President Benson in his talk Civic Standards for Faithful Saints says, you may be inclined to think, okay, this candidate's not a member of the church. Anyhow, he basically talks about the Cyrus principle, that sometimes the Lord keeps somebody from knowing the gospel, excuse me, so they may be more able to have access to political leadership to save the Lord's people. And then President Oaks, in his talk, I think it's the one called Fundamentals of Our Constitutions, talks about there shall be no religious test. Excuse me. Maybe it's one of his other talks. It's one of those ones that's listed on the church website. Once again, emphasizing the same concept. You may think, okay, President Benson sounded pretty extreme. Look at his talk called The Proper Role of Government. One of the main things he emphasizes is it would be a disaster to suddenly stop all unconstitutional programs just out and out. And so it's a much more level-headed kind of approach to gradually correcting this, correcting that, correcting this, correcting that, in a very steady, stable process, a rule of law type of process, as President Oaks would say. And I think when you study President Oaks too, he talks about, instead of going to extreme measures, we should be seeking to moderate. We should be seeking to make our influence felt. So both of them are incredibly level-headed. Now you might think, now President Oaks, though, he's okay with the Supreme Court redefining the Constitution. Please study Fundamentals of Our Constitutions by President Oaks. I had been reviewing his University of Virginia talk again and again, defending our divinely inspired Constitution and others, and I'm like, I am positive he is not a fan of the Supreme Court redefining our Constitutions. And then I rediscovered that talk. It was one I had studied in the past, but it hadn't clicked with me. I've been a kind of a daily studier of the Constitution for about the past 2 or 3 years at this point, maybe less. And so it has clicked with me in a whole new way that, yeah, judicial review, it's impossible that's part of the inspired Constitution. And President Oaks has this very direct statement regarding judicial review in his talk Fundamentals of Our Constitutions. He doesn't think they should be redefining it. He and President Benson, you might think President Benson doesn't like judicial review at all either. He actually says it's appropriate for the Supreme Court to nullify unconstitutional laws, right? So, which is a concept that President J. Reuben Clark taught also, right? So you've got this kind of attitude of the courts shouldn't be enforcing unconstitutional laws, consistent from all of them. The courts should not be the puppets of the legislature. I'll pull over here for a second. I'm not ready to go grab hay, but I want to finish the thought here. So consistently, you've got the same thoughts from all of them. By the way, this shirt, my wife gets these from the thrift store. They're just chores shirts. It's quite hilarious. Once we looked at it later on, we realized what it was. But no, I'm just out doing chores. It's just it's a goofy shirt. All of them believe that the Supreme Court should back off of redefining the Constitution, but where an unconstitutional law is put in place, they should nullify it. None of them are a fan of the judicial branch of the federal judicial branch meddling in things that are none of the federal government's affairs, things that aren't part of the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Every last one of them is concerned about threats to the Constitution. As I've studied the different prophets too, certain messages become quite consistent. One of them is that the Constitution is the fundamental law of Zion, that it won't be saved in Washington. Okay, so there isn't a single prophet that I've seen that said, gee, Washington, D.C., we're going to get a president that's a member of the church and he's going to fix everything for us. Nope, I don't find that. That the Constitution will hang by a thread. That's a very consistent pattern. That we are supposed to know, as members of the church, we have a responsibility to know the Constitution, that it's akin to the words of God, revelations of God, that it's... So, and then again, we're supposed to take this level-headed rule of law type approach to correcting things that are unconstitutional, not this fine then I'm going to start being like 1776 all over again. We've been consistently told they were the best of men that God could find on the earth, right? Yet we have never been encouraged to imitate what they did all over again. Specifically, it's the U.S. Constitution that is kind of the main one we turn to. We believe in the principles of Constitution everywhere, constitutionalism everywhere. But so I guess what I'm saying is, if you think about it, every last prophet that we've had has all served the same Lord. They've had that same gift, that same responsibility, that same mantle put on them. So if it's a dead prophet and he seems to contradict what the living prophet has said, you probably just haven't reviewed their words enough. Don't jump to the gun thinking, oh, these guys contradict each other. Read it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth again, over and over. And next thing you know, you'll be like, oh, wow. This guy's just a little bit more mild how he says this thing that this guy says. And this guy's a little bit more mild about how he says this thing that this guy says. But he's still saying the same thing this guy says. And he's still saying the same thing this guy says. Okay? It's almost like they're all receiving the same guidance from the same Spirit. So that was my thoughts on pitting prophet against prophet, and specializing in studying the Constitution. It's a hobby topic. I know you can get concerned about it. Although, think about it, like when you're reading 2nd Nephi, you don't get to understand 2nd Nephi until you read it again and read it again and read it again, right? You don't get to know the Constitution until you read it again, read it again. And so I finally decided to do that because it's a duty we've been given. Specifically, I want to make a case for one more thing regarding past prophets. Like I said, it's not my responsibility to declare when a prophecy is being fulfilled, the same way that President Nelson said, okay, this prophecy from President Kimball is being fulfilled right now. However, when a prophet of my youth spoke to us saying, you guys are the generation that is going to have to do this, you guys are the generation that we'll need you to do this, how are you going to be prepared for it? And he told us how to prepare for it. The implication was he was going to be dead. Now, this is the same guy who told us to always pay attention to the living prophet, also told us we were the generation who needed to know this stuff, pay attention to it, be prepared for it. So sometimes the warnings come from a past prophet while you're a youth, and they're directed at you. Just because that prophet passes away doesn't mean you forget that prophecy. That would be like just silly and ridiculous. He gave you words of the Lord directed at you. So again, pitting prophet against prophet, nothing about it makes sense. Because in the end, you will find they're all on the same page. Is it our job to declare when prophecy is fulfilled and stuff like that? No. So again, I'm not sure that Dallin H. Oaks is the fulfillment of that prophecy and him reteaching the principles of the Constitution. However, that was one of the key points that President Benson made. And L. Tom Perry endorsed the developing principles that President Oaks had back in the day when he was a younger apostle, which he has refined so much more now if you compare him. So I am willing to say that it at least has me astonished and keeping all these things in my heart. And I think that's an appropriate place to be in the relationship of past prophecies that were directed at my generation, while still following the living prophet. I've already reviewed this most recent General Conference, several of the talks 4 or 5 times, all of them I think at least once. I tend to focus more obviously on the prophet, the apostles, and the first presidency, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I hope nobody thinks that I'm one of these guys that's obsessed with past prophets and stuff. But prophecies are a real thing. The ability of a past prophet to tell you something that's coming in the future, anybody who knows the scriptures even halfway understands that. So, and yeah, so that's my thoughts. Have a nice day.